Hello everyone, I'm KathNicoleC, your next reporter. Now that we've covered the basics of demand, supply, and market equilibrium, it's time to dive into the shocks to the equilibrium. So here's the thing, once a market reaches equilibrium, it seems like everything falls into place, right? In theory, this perfect balance could persist forever as long as nothing pressures the price to change. But that's where things get interesting. The equilibrium can only remain as is until something shocks the system. What do we mean by a shock? Simply put, a shock is anything that causes the demand curve or supply curve to shift. And these shifts happen when one of the key variables we usually hold constant changes. Things like consumer taste, income levels, government policies, or even production costs. Now let's look at a practical example of how a shock or change in income can impact the market equilibrium. Imagine that the average income in high-income countries increases by 15,000, from 35,000 to 50,000. What happens when people suddenly have more money to spend? Well, consumers are likely to purchase more of certain goods, like coffee for instance, at a given price. As a result, the demand for coffee increases. We see this reflected in the shape of the demand curve moving to the right from D1 to D2, as shown here in figure 2.6 of our book. Now let's break this down. At the initial equilibrium price of 2, consumers now want to buy 11.5 million tons of coffee per year. But here's the catch. The suppliers at that price are only willing to provide 10 million tons. This creates a situation where demand exceeds supply, leading to an excess demand of 1.5 million tons. In other words, there's a gap of 1.5 million tons between what consumers want to buy and what suppliers are willing to sell at the current price. This imbalance puts pressure on the market and sets the stage for price adjustments. Now, what happens when there's excess demand like this? The market experiences pressure. When more people wanting to buy than there is available supply, the price begins to rise. As the price increases, the quantity supplied increases as well, while the quantity demanded starts to level off. Eventually, the market adjusts to a new equilibrium. The price rises to 3, where firms are now willing to sell 10.5 million tons of coffee and where consumers are also willing to buy at that point, which is the new equilibrium quantity. So we see that the increase in income causes a shift of the demand curve to the right, and in response, the market moves along the supply curve from the initial equilibrium point E1 to the new equilibrium point E2. This is how markets adjust to shocks, like changes in income, to restore balance. In these next slides, I'll show you how to compute it. The supply function for coffee is this, where Q is the quantity of coffee and P is the price of coffee per pound. While the demand function is where PS is the price of sugar per pound and Y is the average income in high-income countries. For simplicity, let's assume that the initial price of sugar PS is 0.20 per pound and the initial income Y is 35. So step 1 is substituting initial values into the demand function. Please take note that we are using initial values, which in this case is 35. To find the quantity demanded purely as a function of price, we first substitute the initial income, 35, into the demand function, which gives us Q equals 12 minus P. Next, step 2 is solving for the initial equilibrium. Again, this is the initial equilibrium. Now that we have the demand curve, let's find the initial equilibrium price and quantity by setting the supply equal to demand. That means we equate the supply function and the demand function, giving us the initial equilibrium price 2. To find the equilibrium quantity, we substitute this price back into either the supply or demand function. Here, let's use the supply function, which gives us the initial equilibrium quantity at 10 million tons. Step 3 is determining the new equilibrium after the income change. We look at what happens when income increases from 35 to 50. So it's like doing step 1 and 2 all over again, but this time just using 50 instead of 35. Substituting Y to 50 into the demand function, it will give us the new demand Q equals 13.5 minus P, which we will now equate the new demand function with the supply function to find the new equilibrium price. The new equilibrium price is 3. Now let's find the new equilibrium quantity substituting P equals 3 into the supply function, which will give us 10.5 tons per year. So step 4 is calculating the change in price and quantity. So the change in price is 1 and the change in quantity is 0.5 million tons. As we can see, the increase in income has led to an increase of 1 in the equilibrium price and 0.5 million tons increase in the equilibrium quantity of coffee. These shifts reflect the effects of an increase in income on the demand for coffee, which ultimately drives the market toward a new equilibrium. In the graph shown a while ago, we can clearly see the shift in the demand curve and how the price and quantity adjust accordingly. Let's now consider how a shift in the supply curve affects the coffee market equilibrium. Imagine that the price of cocoa rises from 3 per pound to 6 per pound. This price hikes makes cocoa more profitable, causing some coffee producers to switch to cocoa production. As a result, the supply of coffee decreases, and the supply curve shifts to the left from S1 to S2. At the original equilibrium price of 2 per pound, consumers still want to buy 10 million tons of coffee, but producers are now only willing to supply 9.4 million tons due to the shift in production. This creates an excess demand of 0.6 million tons. With this excess demand, market pressure pushes the price of coffee up. The prices rises until the market reaches a new equilibrium, where the equilibrium price is now 2.40 per pound and the equilibrium quantity is 9.6 million tons. In this scenario, the shift in the supply curve leads to a movement along the demand curve, resulting in both a higher price and a lower quantity of coffee in the market. In summary, when there's a change in an underlying factor, whether it's income, the price of a related good, land use, or the cost of production, it causes either the demand curve or the supply curve to shift. And whenever this curve shifts, the market's equilibrium also changes. To understand the impact of this shift, we compare the original equilibrium price and quantity to the new equilibrium values after the change. This comparison helps us see how the market adjusts in response to shifts in supply or demand, whether it's a price increase or a change in quantity or both. Managers can actually use the supply and demand model to anticipate how shocks like changes in supply or demand will affect the future business conditions. By understanding this dynamics, managers can take advantage of the knowledge to make strategic decisions, whether it's adjusting pricing, altering production levels, or anticipating changes in consumer behavior. Now, let's shift our focus to the role of governments in shaping market outcomes. Often, governments are responsible for changes in market equilibrium, and there are a few key ways they do this. First, some government actions can directly shift the supply curve, the demand curve, or both curves. When this happens, the equilibrium price and quantity in the market change. For example, if a government imposes a new regulation on production or introduces subsidies, it can either increase or decrease the supply of a good, shifting the supply curve and affecting equilibrium. Second, governments can use price controls to intervene in the market. These are rules that set maximum or minimum prices, often referred to as price ceilings and price floors. Price controls prevent the market from reaching its natural equilibrium and often create situations where the quantity demanded doesn't match the quantity supplied. Finally, the government may decide to tax or subsidize certain goods. When a good is taxed, the price consumers pay may be higher than what producers receive, creating a gap. Conversely, subsidies make goods cheaper for consumers while allowing producers to receive more for their product than they would otherwise. These interventions also affect the equilibrium price and quantity, but in ways that depend on how the tax or subsidy is structured. In each case, government interventions changes the natural market equilibrium, affecting both consumers and producers in different ways. Understanding these effects helps businesses, policymakers, and consumers anticipate the consequences of such actions. Let's now look at how government policies can cause demand or supply curves to shift in the market. First, government can directly influence demand by restructuring who can purchase certain goods. For instance, many governments have laws that forbid selling alcohol to young people. This restriction reduces the quantity demanded at each price as younger consumers are no longer part of the market. As a result, the demand curve shifts to the left, reflecting a decrease in overall demand for alcohol at any given price. On the other hand, the government can also impact supply. A common way this happens is through import restrictions. When a government imposes limits on the number of foreign products that can be imported, such as cars, electronics, or textiles, this decreases the quantity supplied of those goods at each price. The supply curve for these imported goods shifts to the left, meaning at any given price, fewer goods are available in the market. So now let's dive into price controls, which are another form of government intervention. Price controls are policies where the government sets limits on the price of a good, regardless of the normal market forces of supply and demand. Price controls can affect the market outcome even though they don't directly impact the demand or supply curves. The key point here is that if the price the government sets is different from the unregulated equilibrium price, this can lead to either excess supply or excess demand in the market. There are two main types of price controls policies: price ceilings and price floors. A price ceiling is the maximum price at which a good can be sold. For example, if the government sets a price ceiling at 10,000 pesos, no goods can be sold at a price higher than 10,000 pesos. The goal of a price ceiling is typically to make goods more affordable for consumers, especially in cases like housing. Think of rent controls in certain cities. However, if the price ceiling is set too low, below the market equilibrium price, it can create a shortage. That's because at the lower price, more consumers want the good but producers are less willing to supply it. On the other side, a price floor sets the minimum price which a good can be sold. For example, if the government sets a price floor of 600 pesos, no goods can be sold below that price. Price floors are often used in markets like labor, such as minimum wage laws. When the price floor is set above the equilibrium price, it can create an excess supply or surplus. This happens because the higher price encourages producers to supply more, but consumers are less willing to purchase at the higher price. Now let's talk about why the supply doesn't always equal demand in the market. This is something that comes up a lot, especially when the government steps in with policies like price controls. When we talk about quantity supplied, we mean how much sellers are willing to sell at a certain price, assuming nothing else changes. Similarly, quantity demanded is how much buyers want to buy at that price, assuming other factors stay the same. But here's the important point. The quantity supplied and the quantity demanded don't always match the actual amount that gets bought and sold in the market. Why don't they match? We could have defined supply and demand differently. If we define quantity supplied as the actual amount firms sell and quantity demanded as the actual amount consumers buy, then yes, supply would always equal demand in every market. But in the supply and demand model, we define this in terms of wants. How much people want to buy and sell at a certain price, not the actual quantities that get exchanged. This is important because many people get confused and think that supply and demand must always equal to each other. But in the model, supply equals demand is more of a theory, a way of explaining what happens when there's no government intervention. When the government gets involved with things like price ceilings or price floors, it can stop the market from clearing, meaning the quantity supply doesn't match the quantity demanded. For example, a price ceiling set too low causes excess demand, shortages. A price floor set too high causes excess supply, surpluses. So in these cases, the supply and demand don't match the actual quantity sold or bought because the government is interfering with the price. Let's talk about sales taxes. Sales taxes are imposed by the government on various goods and services, and they can really affect both consumers and producers. For instance, in the Philippines, the government introduced taxes on sugary drinks as part of efforts to fight rising health issues like obesity. But taxes aren't always as straightforward as we think. Governments impose these taxes to raise revenue, but they can also have big effects on the market. Now let's focus on the specific type of sales tax, the specific tax. This is when the government charges a fixed amount per unit of the goods sold. For example, here in the Philippines, there's an excise tax on sugar, sweetened beverages, and certain tobacco products. So let's take a 20 peso per unit tax on a product like soda. Here's how this would play out if the government were to apply a tax like this. So before the tax, let's say the equilibrium price for a soda is 40 pesos, and manufacturers are willing to supply 12 billion per year. After the tax, once the tax is imposed, the supply curve shifts. Let's say now if consumers are willing to pay 40 pesos, manufacturers will only receive 20 pesos after paying the tax. This price is not enough for them to supply as much as before. So in order to keep supplying 11.6 billion, consumers now need to pay 60 pesos per soda. So the price consumers pay will increase to 60 pesos due to the tax. After paying the tax, producers only receive 40 pesos. As a result, the quantity of soda in the market falls to 11.6 billion. Finally, let's address a common question. Who actually bears the burden of the tax? In the Philippines, many people think that the companies or producers pass on the entire tax to consumers, meaning the price you pay should go up by the full amount of the tax. But this isn't always true. Both producers and consumers share the tax burden. Consumers end up paying a higher price because the tax makes the product more expensive. Producers receive a lower price for the product because the tax reduces the amount they keep after selling. So it's a shared burden. And the price doesn't always rise by the full tax amount. To sum up, while taxes can help fund government projects, they also have important effects on prices and market quantities. In this case, a specific tax, consumers pay more, producers receive less, and the government gains revenue. What managers want to know is how much of these increased costs they can pass through to consumers. In other words, how much of the cost rise they charge their customers in the form of higher prices. This is where the pass-through analysis comes in. Not all of the increased costs will necessarily be passed on to consumers. The ability to pass on costs depends on things like price sensitivity of consumers and market competition. Managers need to predict how much of the cost increase will be absorbed by producers and how much will be reflected in higher prices for consumers. By using pass-through analysis, managers can make better pricing decisions, ensuring that they can cover rising costs while maintaining their market position and profitability. In summary, pass-through analysis is a valuable tool for managers to anticipate how cost changes will impact their pricing strategy and ultimately their bottom line. To wrap up, the supply and demand model is a fundamental tool in economics. It provides us with a clear and structured way to understand how markets function and how prices are determined. By analyzing the interaction between supply and demand, we can predict what will happen in a market when factors like prices, income, or availability of goods change. While the model is incredibly useful, it's not perfect. It performs best in highly competitive markets with many buyers and sellers, where products are identical or very similar across producers. In these markets, no single buyer or seller can affect the price. For example, if a wheat farmer stops selling, it will change the price of wheat because there are so many others in the market. Consumers also don't care which firm they buy from, as long as the product is the same. These markets also feature free entry and exit, meaning firms can easily enter when there's profit opportunity or exit when conditions change. The model assumes that all market participants have full information about prices and product characteristics, and that transaction costs like the time and effort involved in making a trade are low. However, the model doesn't capture every market scenario. In monopolies or oligopolies where a few firms dominate and can set prices, a supply and demand model might not be as accurate. In these cases, firms can influence the price because they control much of the supply. But even in these scenarios, the supply and demand model still provides valuable insights into the general behavior of markets and especially effective in understanding price dynamics in competitive environments. Ultimately, while the supply and demand model might not apply in every market, it offers a reliable framework for understanding the dynamics of competitive markets. This framework is crucial for predicting price changes, understanding market behavior, and making informed business and policy decisions. That would be all. Thank you.